There are 4 boxes of Smarties left, and I want to acknowledge there's 3 boxes of Smarties left. I want to acknowledge Garth for bringing the chocolates tonight. And getting everybody completely wired. There was a comment that maybe people didn't want to be smart tonight. So how's that? We're going to move on to UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. These little books. Okay. UNDRIP was very, very long in the negotiations, and I can't tell you, and I don't know all of the long history of the negotiations for UNDRIP. But one of the things you should recognize, and there's a note at the back of this, that when UNDRIP was finally agreed upon at the United Nations, there were 4 countries that refused to sign on to it initially. And those 4 countries, of course, are the 4 classic settler countries, including Canada. Canada, United States, Australia, and New Zealand. So the 4 countries that have the, how do we put it, which way do you want to put it? The most interest in oppressing Indigenous peoples? Or the least interest in signing a declaration of their rights? Whichever way around you want to put it. And it's taken a fairly long struggle in Canada for Canada to sign on to and to recognize UNDRIP. And then, of course, it's taken even longer for people to actually not only sign on, but to actually get implemented. So it's an extremely interesting document. And one of the things that you probably don't realize is that there is actually a standing committee at the United Nations consisting of Indigenous peoples or Indigenous peoples organizations from around the world who basically oversee the implementation, the work of UNDRIP around the world. So it involves a lot of different groups. The Inuit have been particularly active in that. Okay. But so actually it was also the Cree of Quebec more than the Western Cree, and deeply engaged in that process. So it's like most things with the United Nations. It's a declaration of principle, all right, and then the question becomes how to actually apply those principles.
Or if. I mean, in fairness, you know, there are countries that have signed on in 2007 to UNDRIP and have no intention of ever implementing it.
That's true. There are also a number of countries who signed on for whom it's actually useless, pointless. I mean, there's not a whole lot of point for Austria. You know, there's not a whole lot of Indigenous people that I'm aware of, other than Roma, in Austria. So. There are problems around that. The way, just to tell you, the way it's generally structured as you begin to go through it and look at it, is you'll find that in the articles, the first part of the article makes a declaration about a particular principle, and the second part of the article basically says the state shall do something to implement this. Okay, so that's the way it's structured as you go through it, and try to make sense out of all the different parts of it. So, did you have something you wanted to say? That's a very general comment. Nope. Okay.
Well, I was just going to say that really there is nothing in there that really. That everybody should have, right? That these are rights that currently, I think, probably exist within the countries for everybody, except that they really haven't been implemented to the same extent to Indigenous people.
If at all.
If at all.
Yeah.
So some people would say, well, UNDRIP is not asking for anything that isn't supposed to be there.
Yeah, that's the problem.
That's not quite true, right?
What?
Well, expropriation of land, for example. Like, every government can expropriate land from most of the citizens. If there's a highway going to go through the middle of my land, the government can come and take it.
We can't.
Whereas there's written in here that we can't take any land from.
Well, no, it does say it can't do it without free, informed, and prior consent.
And compensation.
And compensation.
And not only compensation, but the consent part as well. I would not give consent necessarily for the highway to go through my farmland either, but they could do it.
They can, but no, it does require free, prior, and informed consent. And you see that, you'll find that phrase all the way through, by the way.
I've just read it.
Yeah.
Before I came.
There's a bit of a difference, though, with rights of way. There's a bit of a difference in appropriating that land to appropriating mass chunks of land. Right.
I
So I think that this is what it's getting to that part, right? That says you cannot just go and take over somebody's homeland.
I understand that, and the prof that's taught me constitutional history of Canada says something to the effect that they drew up this constitution and they figured it would not go in the direction it went in. Like, for example, the provinces taking all the rights that they got in terms of health care. That the original people put together figured it wasn't going to go in that direction, it would go to more of a national government. And you don't know, it doesn't say in here who's going to arbitrate these kind of decisions, so you don't know where it's going to go. There's no delineation of the arbitration in here. You don't know, I mean, it could go in a very fine direction, and it could go into some really direction completely unexpected, which is what happened with, say, Canadian Constitution, at least according to the experts, the Sunday experts.
Well, there are two things in here. Vince is right about the appropriation of large areas, and that's actually what it's after. But one of the things about something like a UN declaration, which is different from the Canadian Constitution, is that it's an international. And it does place you in an international context which says that you're now responsible not just to the Canadian Constitution, not just to the Canadian courts, you're actually responsible to the international community.
So that's exactly what I understand. But what does that mean? You know, like right now, for example, people with Donald Trump in place in the United States, like, do you really want to be him to be the one that decides?
No, but there are such things as international courts, okay? And in fact, I think that's actually the Mohawks again, since Dale's threatening me already with the fact that she's got a drop of Mohawk blood in her. I'm teasing you. Have actually taken Canada in the international court. Now that's extremely embarrassing for Canada to be taken by First Nations to an international court. Okay, it undermines our credibility in all sorts of fashions. And so the history of these things, and there have been a couple, very little, but the history of these things has been when First Nations do things like that, when they take Canada to the international fora on these issues, it is so embarrassing that the Canadian government tends to move rather quickly on the issue. Okay? So it does have some import moving it from a national to an international level. And I think that's important. And it doesn't mean that Donald Trump ends up being the judge. Well, in fact, one of the things Donald Trump has done is withdrawn the Americans from all of that stuff.
Exactly.
Well, that's fine. There are lots of other countries who can sit on the court. They don't have to be Americans. There are lots of other countries who sit in the United Nations. Right? Now, as Paul nicely pointed out, that a lot of those other countries haven't as much interest in enforcing this as well, they have no interest in enforcing it. But that still means that it takes it to an international level. I think the other thing that you need to think about, and one of the things that's very tricky, this picks up on what we've got here, here's the thinking point, guys. Rod, are you ready to get another headache this week? He wrote to me complaining he got a headache last week. So. Well, you did too, Sheila. Okay, sorry.
That's because I wasn't here.
He wasn't here. Here's the thinking point. Are Indigenous rights, are Aboriginal rights, the same as human rights, or are they different? Now, my colleague to my left just said that they are the same. And I would beg to differ with him, that Aboriginal rights and human rights are the same.
Oh, no. I would never say that.
Well, you just did, so now defend your case.
Indigenous rights, I mean, human rights are quite different in that, I mean, we're all supposed to be equal. We're supposed to have the right to food, to shelter, to peace, and
Peace, order, and good government. You're
exactly,
a good Canadian.
right? and all of those things that everybody enjoys. However, though, Indigenous rights are quite different. They are ones that are unique to this country. So, so I wouldn't say that they're human rights. They're not.
Yeah, I would agree. No, I just wanted to get that out.
No, I was just saying that in terms of that this is a level. What this does is levels the playing field. Is what this does. So that
Article 1.
every single
Article
one
1,
of us
Article 1.
has all of this, right?
Well,
Supposedly.
and this is part of the problem with this. That's where I was trying to see if I could get my colleague here riled, and it worked. This is operating very much on the level of human rights. It's trying to level the playing field. And it is saying that we are all equal, we're all equal before the law, and a whole series of things around that. There's not a lot in there that talks about that distinctive set of rights that Indigenous peoples might have on their own. The technical term is sui generis, coming out of the origins, from having been the original occupants and owners of the land. Okay. Sui generis? Well, I have to look at, I have to check with Andrew over there of my use of Latin, because that's legal Latin. So,
May I have a question?
yeah.
The Diocese of Toronto, where I was a couple of years ago, tried to have parishes pass a motion to say, essentially, yay UNDRIP. I mean, I don't think it was going to have any particular. And the parish in which I was serving failed to do so. Because somebody stood up and said, I looked at it, and Article 26 says Indigenous peoples have the rights to the lands which they have traditionally owned, which means all of us have to give up our houses because we have to give them back to the Indigenous peoples, so I can't support this. And everybody else went, oh, I hadn't looked at it, I guess I better vote against it then.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you might offer some comments on this piece. I mean, because in some ways what this is more generous than the treaties at a certain level. And I'm not sure, like where the treaties and UNDRIP are not necessarily in accord. I mean, there's a provision here I read that says that we're not going to supersede any of the treaties with this. But in some places it's actually more generous than
Well,
the treaties.
these are all part of the treaties that already exist, right? And Native people would argue that Indigenous people have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned.
But that's the whole country, traditionally owned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But according to,
Yeah.
like, according to
So-
Treaty 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and all
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
other number of treaties, this was something that Indigenous people really would argue that they've never given up.
Yeah.
So this is still, whether or not the people in Ontario like it,
Yeah, yeah.
it might be different there because I don't think they really have that many number of treaties.
No.
Well,
Treaties that are kind
they're
of
different. No, they're land
It's a
things.
whole different.
Yeah.
And so the interpretation of that would be
Yeah.
quite different, but in terms of in this area, I would say that all of these things still are very much there.
And I think the other question you have to ask, Heather, and I think this is probably the point that comes out of there, is when you're talking about rights in land, you think about rights in land, what does that mean? Does that mean that this is what we've been talking about, that Western notion of ownership, which Vince has already told us he has a huge problem with. Does it mean that in Toronto, since you happen to drag Toronto into the story, in Toronto, it's not that the Mississauga, who are the traditional, well,
Among the traditional occupants.
they are the most current traditional occupants of Toronto. It was, of course, Wendat before that. Does that mean, might that mean, not that so much that the Mississauga have the rights to your house and that land upon which your house, but they have the responsibility for overseeing and caring for and the health and well-being of the land, in which case they may have a responsibility for talking with Toronto about how you develop parks, rivers, care for the land in Toronto. There are different, I think the point is that in the modern context, there are different kinds of responsibilities with respect to the land and other resources, incidentally. And that what we need to open ourselves up to is that our fee simple ownership of the land granted to us by the Canadian government does not, it should engage us in that, but that responsibility might still rest with somebody else. And that's the way I prefer to think about it. That in fact the Cree, the Anishinaabe, the Métis still have the responsibility for upholding and caring for this land. And if I can put it this way, seeing that it reproduces appropriately. Okay? In which case they then would have then they would have the right to say something. I think that's a different way of thinking about it. And so you begin to ask your question, what kind of, when we talk about Indigenous peoples maintaining the rights in their land, what are those rights and how do they exist? Okay? And we've assumed that all rights have evaporated. First Nations have assumed that that's not the case. And so I think that's where the discussion comes. And that's where a human right differs from an Aboriginal right. Okay? So in a human right, Vince and I both have equal rights with respect to the land. And we can both buy a house in Winnipeg. All right? Neither of us can afford it, but both of us could buy it, right? But that's where an Indigenous right is different. Because Vince has the additional right and responsibility for upholding and caring for that land. And I'm not saying I don't have it, but that's where his right would impinge on mine. So now this gets tricky. Think about it in Winnipeg. It's the, I can't remember the name of the area now, the wetland just down here that they just ran the transit way through. What was that? Barker Wetlands? Yeah. We got into a really interesting dispute over that, which it was very distressing to watch, because you saw the Métis in particular upholding their, well, it's also part of Rooster Town, upholding their right. They didn't own any of the land, okay? But they were upholding their right to protect and care for that land, and to speak on behalf of the land and the animals that lived in that area, as part of their Indigenous right, which of course we ran the transit way through anyway.
I mean, that's continuing everywhere.
Yeah.
The Grassy Narrows people do that all the time. There's a tent outside at the international border between Canada and the United States that is now, speaking on behalf of the land to these multi-corporations, right? And Indigenous people have always said to the government of Manitoba and even to Winnipeg that, hey, listen, maybe you should treat the land better, right? And so those kinds of things still continue. And it's not just a right, it's an obligation too. But it is an obligation that, with the understanding that Indigenous people have, is that it is not just my obligation, it's Chris's as well.
Yes,
right?
that's where I was phrasing it back.
Yeah.
But you see, I think that's where we get, when we read these things, our first jump is, oh, I'll be rude about it, the Indians want my house. Well, no. I don't think any First Nation would take that kind of approach.
Yeah.
Okay? But they are taking many other kinds of approaches. And that relates especially in terms of resource development. Okay? So, by the way, I still don't know what every parish in Toronto passing this would
Accomplishment.
accomplish, but
Yeah.
other than the fact that it would make everybody read it.
Well, very.
Some churches are giving back, though.
Yeah. Yeah. This was a diocese that every year had a social justice motion go to all the parishes so that the bishops could speak and say, X number, I'm speaking on behalf of X number of parishes, X number of Anglicans, when I say whatever. That's
This is an ongoing conversation in the Diocese of Huron, where as parishes and congregations, particularly in rural areas, close up because they're done, there are lots of questions about whether or not the parish was established on ceded land, unceded land, purchased land, land that was lent out. And so every time a parish closes, there's a discussion with lawyers and First Nations and who does this belong to now that the Anglican Church is done using it.
No.
There's no trees there, right? In a lot of the places you're talking about, there's no trees.
Yeah.
And of course, what's often interesting is how the Anglican Church acquired some of these in the first place. That's often an interesting question to ask, is exactly by what means did our church acquire certain pieces of property in certain lands? Yeah.
It's also good to realise that this is a United Nations, as Vince said, specific to it's not just specific to Canada. This goes for the Maoris, for the Aborigines, for all Indigenous peoples across the world. Right? Am I right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a very broad-reaching statement, and not particular.
Well, I think what the TRC has asked us to do is to say, take this broad-reaching thing and ask what do we do with it in Canada?
How can we particularize it?
Yeah. And so the well, here you go, Article 4. Indigenous peoples in exercising their right to self-determination have the right to autonomy or self-government. Qualified. In matters relating to their internal and local affairs, as well as ways and means for financing their autonomous functions. You got to always read the entire clause. The first half is fine. In matters relating to their internal and local affairs, that's basically municipal government, which is what they already have. No, that's not what the issue is about. Right? Okay, and that's why you have to be careful in how you read these things and how you see them. It says every Indigenous individual has a right to, I'm reading Article 6, has a right to a nationality. Yeah, no.
When I read that, I went back. That should
who's-
be implied, I would think, but it's like that elder who said, I woke up one day I was Native, and next morning I woke up I was Canadian. And nobody bothered to ask.
Or tell you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you get people like the Mohawks, back to them again, who refuse.
Yeah.
Okay? They simply refuse to be either Canadian or American. So they state it quite clearly. There are a lot of discussion in here that they should not be subjected to forced subjugation or assimilation. And there's a lot of discussion in here that Indigenous children should not be taken from the families. How are we doing on that, folks?
Boo.
Yeah,
Still,
yeah.
Yeah, that's the story.
yeah. It's still happening now.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
In a fairly substantial and major way. I don't know if I said it to this group, but my wife Terry works at West Broadway Community Ministry on a, well, from my point of view, a 2 regular basis. But, and what she always says that one of the things that breaks her heart there is the young women who are pregnant, who simply assume that their child will be taken away from them when they give birth to them.
And all it means is they don't have a permanent resident and they will lose their child.
Well, it means that there's a few other things that later.
Yeah, but that's one of the
One
big things, is
yeah.
if they don't have a permanent resident, they will lose their child.
You know, my wife said to me, she's saying it from a woman's point of view, but even I get it. How can you possibly be, you know, gestating, growing a child in your body, knowing that it's going to be taken away from you almost the instant after it's born? You know, that to me that's almost unthinkable. But when you realize that that's the way these young women are thinking, I think that tells you how perverted the system has become.
Chris, is it not the case that there are more children in CFS care now than there were involved in residential schools?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah. Justice Sinclair said last week that the CFS childcare is the residential schools of the 21st century. So that wasn't quite what he said, but that's the gist of what he said. So you know, when we look at something like UNDRIP, and we look through each of the clauses, and we ask ourselves the question, how is Canada doing with respect to these? In fact, I think you find we're pretty poorly to bad, certainly uneven. Okay. Well, here we go. Indigenous people have the right to dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information. Are we doing that?
No.
The last time I taught my sons, well, this is a long time ago, the last time I taught my son's grade 6 class, I had a fit because the kids had the First Nations buffalo hunting on Victoria Island, or Vancouver Island. And I'm thinking, has anybody ever been to Vancouver Island? You know, buffalo couldn't move 3 inches on Vancouver Island. Stuck between the trees.
Wood bison.
Huh?
Wood bison.
Pretty skinny wood bison. Pretty big trees.
Today, Chris, I met
It's changed.
a 6-year-old boy named Tyrone who's learning. Now I heard this language is Soto.
Yeah, you are starting to get.
It's in one of the schools here.
Yeah, but it's very uneven. It's very often very weak and inaccurate. And you know, they're working hard at our end to try and teach all the teachers at this end.
Get politicians to learn an Indigenous language.
It would help if the Indigenous Studies Department at the University of Manitoba would learn Indigenous languages, but I won't go down that one. I have fought for 20 years with my colleagues in my department over the fact that of the 6 of us, only 2 of us speak Indigenous languages, and one is a white guy, and the other is a Cree woman. She speaks her own language. The rest don't speak an Indigenous language, and I'm like, how can we possibly teach? All right, but we do. I should be careful without dragging the nasty linen of my particular department into this place. But so that's it. So it's not even being reflected at this level. Okay.
Wow.
I would also say that it's not going in the other direction either. A group of young people went to Clay this year, and some of them came from Easterville, not Easter Island. Easterville, up in northern Manitoba, and they saw a blanket exercise for the very first time, and were horrified that was their story, and they didn't know it either. They went back to their communities saying, "What the heck?"
Yeah.
Well, probably even more than that. But you know, this is our history. This is what happened.
Yeah.
And they didn't know about it. They just live where they live because that's where they live.
Yep. Well, we have teaching in here at the University of Manitoba, teaching first-year Native Studies is well, I haven't done it for a number of years, but it's an interesting experience. with as much the Indigenous people learning as the others. And I have to tell you a tragic story. When we were working in Pangnirtung, there's this movie which I will tell you I'm very ambivalent about the movie. It's a movie called Nuyayuk, the Mother of Sea Beasts, and it's made by a guy called John Huston. It's a very interesting movie, but there's some really quirky things in it that get me upset. But part of it's filmed in Pangnirtung, okay? And we, as part of the course that we taught, we always showed this film, and I still show it to my classes, the classes that I teach. So we showed it to the students, our students up in Pang, but one of the ways we ran our program in Pang was any of the young people in Pang were invited to join with our students in the classes and participate in the discussions and participate in the classes. And a number did. And we showed them this film. And afterwards I said to the class, okay, any questions, any discussion, anything you want to know about? This horrible silence. Oh, this went across really well. That's one of my finer moments in pedagogy. And one of the guys got up, one of the Inuit guys from Pangnirtung got up and said, I'm as mad as hell. I thought, oh, what have I done now? He said, my elders are in there telling that story. They're in that movie telling that story to a white guy, and they refuse to tell those stories to us. They won't tell us those stories. We were told those stories aren't around anymore. And he said, now I know that our elders know them. And I'm going to go back and ask them. I thought, oh dear.
Well done, Chris.
but that's the kind of thing you're talking about.
Yeah.
They found out from us that their elders were not telling them things that they knew.
I hear there was a man who didn't respect his elders.
Me? Yes, but that's okay. No, it was really it was a really interesting encounter, and one of the finer scenes in the movie is a reenactment of because the original event happened in 1902. It's a reenactment of the women sewing a coat for Nuyayuk, somebody who said the Mother of the Sea Beasts. The women sewed this coat, and then when they became Christians, they threw the coat into the ocean. Okay? And they reenacted this in the movie. And all these kids are sitting there going, that's my aunt. She's sewing that coat. She knows what this is all about. And there she is throwing it into the ocean. She knows what's going on here. All right? Why has she never told me this story? And then they wanted to know the story from 1902. Of course, they're asking me. Right?
Well, it's the same reason why, I think, why my grandfather, when he was teaching me our tradition, said, don't tell anyone.
Yeah. So you didn't tell anybody, I hope.
No. Right? And it was because you weren't allowed to at a certain time. And so that thing just really was entrenched into your brain, really. Especially when they built something like Stony Mountain Prison to house all of these Native people who did that. And so it's something that wasn't allowed at one point. And so it's still
very strongly felt.
Did you say John Huston? The John Huston?
And it's the John Huston, yes. There's a family history there.
I mean, the African Queen, John Huston?
No, not the African
No,
Queen.
no,
John
no.
Huston.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry. There's another family history. There's a Canadian John Huston.
Very good.
yes.
Sorry about my ignorance.
No, that's okay. His father is James Huston, and James Huston invented contemporary Inuit carving. Well, with the Inuit of Papamataki, he invented contemporary Inuit carving. John followed on from his father's footsteps. John was brought up in Cape Dorset. So,
Is it Inuit?
no,
No.
Okay.
as Inuit as I am.
It seems like with what you're talking about, particularly the not telling the stories of culture, that a good deal of what this is talking about is trying to redress that. So in a sense, wasn't exactly sure what you meant when you said before that with the idea of leveling the playing field. looking at unique rights, but that sense that it has to be more than what we would think of as standard human rights because of the necessity to redress wrongs. We don't need a principle or a right that says we can maintain our culture.
No.
It's not necessary. So that this contains things that if looked at properly, and I keep getting the sense as we talk about things, hence the headache, that people can interpret things in a completely different way, the same principle, the same treaty, the same whatever, in a completely different way and come to a completely different conclusion, but at least in the way that I read it, that we're saying here, we mention the forced relocation, we mention the school, we mention the culture, we mention that, because those are things that have to be corrected.
Yes.
That's damage that needs to be undone, and that's the work that it needs to highlight.
And I think you're right on that. It takes the, who was I talking to just beforehand about issues of white privilege? I know who I was talking to. Apparently I have to go and do a course in medical school now on white privilege. You assume, and that's a fair assumption, Sheila, that you can tell your stories, whatever crazy stories you have from your own heritage and family, you can tell those to your kids and pass them on. Or you can tell them to us if we ask you to tell them, right? And what Vince just said is his grandfather didn't, well, and you don't feel the right to be able to tell those stories.
Well, not now. Wait till I get older. Because I'm not a number yet.
Oh, I know. I was going to say, how long have we got to wait there, Vince?
Probably one more year. So they tell me.
Maybe we should re-offer this course next year.
Then we get the real goods.
Yeah. And get the. But you're right. You don't even have to think about your right and ability to tell your story, your history, no matter how wonky it may be, or how good it might be. The people we're talking about don't have the right to tell their own story. Well, this says they do have the right, but that right has been taken away. And that's right, it's still being struggled for in the community.
Well, and I think that part of the challenges with that is that even if the right is named, there's cultural change that needs to happen in order for people to be able to tell their story and have it actually be heard and not just dismissed and or minimized or appropriated or any of those.
Well, I think you put your finger on actually something that is very delicate in these situations, and it's one that Vince and I have actually spent time talking about. These folks are Christians now, all right? And as Christians, we tell them that all those stories are evil, bad, heathen, come from the devil, all kinds of narratives around what those stories are. That they shouldn't be telling those stories because those aren't Christian stories. So we have to own the responsibility here. And part of the problem in your background, part of the problem in Anglican, is that the church is telling them you're not allowed to tell those stories. So we have to, and I think we have to ask ourselves a real tough question is, well, so what's wrong with telling those stories, and how do we get past that wrong?
But isn't that even more complicated than that? I mean, we as the larger white church, if you will, are also saying now, the stories we told you replaced your stories are no longer on anymore, because we now have progressed to this point where, we're progressive and liberal, and therefore, the story we told you was right 100 years ago. And so that's a big issue. I mean, it was in Toronto a couple of years ago. It will be next year in Vancouver.
Well, you're talking about sex.
Well, I'm talking about in this case, yes, but it's it's not just that. It's even just
nobody's property.
yeah.
Well, but I think it's a tough question. Say, I don't know how many verbs I can get into one sentence. How do we create a space, how do we give permission for First Nations to give themselves permission to tell all of these stories? And we are involved in that because we're the ones who denied it. And you're also right that we now are changing our relationship with stories.
Well, that's Bishop Mark next.
Next week.
But that's, in a way, there's a great fallacy about rights. In one sense, there's no such thing as rights. The rights are simply what I agree and you agree will allow each other, which can change at any time if I change my mind or my mood or
Well, they're not
whatever.
supposed to, that's why we have constitutions and things.
Yeah.
Yes.
But the whole notion of rights, in one sense, is a fallacy.
Okay, that's a really interesting argument, Brian, which takes us in a different direction.
Yes.
Is the rights language the right kind of language
Well.
to use to talk about this? What kind of other kind of language can we use to talk about this?
And even for one group to say to another, you can't do this or that, the only thing that's enforcing that is power, might,
Yeah, the big
physical
stick.
force.
Or communal agreement.
And it struck me, Sheila, when you said about, we don't have to worry about that, which is true, I mean, here and now, today. But if you were, say, a Jew in 1936 in Germany, that's a whole different
Weekend in
situation.
Pittsburgh.
Or whatever, yeah.
The other thing is
So-
writing it down doesn't necessarily make it happen, right? My understanding was that the Russian Federation had the best constitution in the world. I know the books on which the Russian Revolution was based was really egalitarian and lots of women's rights, lots of equality of food and money, and none of it came to fruition. The whole constitution was basically just ignored, and Stalin did what he wanted to do.
Well, I'm going to say, we did well until Stalin. I'm a great fan of Lenin, but we won't get into that. Also, because my favorite children's author was Lenin, married Lenin's secretary. Donna. But there is a point there, yeah.
I'm interested that the language of human rights has come up within the context of this conversation, because it seems that, while important, certainly, the language of human rights is really grounded in some ways in the privatization of the individual.
Yes.
And so, so much good has been accomplished through the utilization of this language and all that it represents. At the same time, as a community of faith, when we talk about the body of Christ, it's tough to know how we can maneuver that language within the context of a very different culture, which is the church. Tom Morgan, past bishop of somewhere in Saskatchewan, he made the comment at General Synod a number of years ago that we, as a Christian people of faith, we actually need to be bilingual. So we have to understand the language of our faith, but we also have to understand the language of human rights and know how to maneuver between the two.
Well, I think the point is one that we were talking about whenever we talked about Trudeau and the white paper. The idea that the liberal notion that the rights are vested in the individual person, which comes very, very much out of the late 18th century American Constitution model of how rights subsist. And as I was reading this, by the way, and let's get back to this. As I was reading this, I was thinking about that. All right, because it tries to cover both, and I'm not sure it's successful because it does say, I just happen to be open at Article 17. It doesn't matter which article I'm on, but it says Indigenous individuals and peoples have the right to enjoy fully all rights established under applicable international and domestic labor law. That's an interesting one.
But mostly it starts in indigenous peoples.
Yes.
It has that much more than individuals.
Yeah. So this document is trying to play both sides of that fence, I think. I think it would be really interesting to do two things with it. One is to ask how well does it play both sides of that fence? I think actually it plays the collective people's side very poorly. It plays the individual rights quite well. And then the second question is your question. What is a Christian understanding in that context? And, yeah.
We have to interpret exactly what do you mean by Christian to begin with.
Yes.
Right?
I was about to say something, and I better shut up before I get into the theology.
Well, are we talking about Western theology as Christianity, Western Christianity, or are we talking Indigenous Christianity?
Yes.
Which is now starting to surface and rise, right? The two would interpret things in a very different way, and would interpret Scripture in a very different way. And so sometimes, people who say Indigenous people have the right to, if they're not Indigenous, for me, I need to stop them. Right? What are you saying to me as an Indigenous person? Are you giving me the permission? Are you giving me the right? Are you giving me, the ability to whatever, right? And whereas with me, I would say, I already have that. No one needs to tell me, no one needs to let me know what my rights as an individual or as a person of God, a created being, has.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that these things do exist, because if anything, they promote dialogue and they have us discussing these things and what is and sometimes these things are what can be or what should be, right? So it's important.
Yeah.
So it's very important, but for the federal government to tell me what my rights are and they keep interpreting what my rights are is another way of saying, oh, you savages don't know how to govern yourselves, so we're going to do it for you.
That's also, yes, and it's also a question, is rights language the way to talk about it? See, I'm not entirely sure of that. I don't know what other language to use. Well, I don't know how to say it in Inuktitut. Yeah, well, let's try it in Cree. How do you say that in Cree? How do you say it in Inuktitut?
There are no rights in these
No,
obligations.
that's
what
well,
it is. It's
they're
an
obligations and responsibilities.
Yes.
Well, even if you could find the words,
Yeah.
it wouldn't have the same meaning at all.
The Anglican Church of Canada, I think it was in the late 1990s, maybe early 2000s, did adopt a document which was, I think, quite wonderful, but then became relatively obscure very quickly, as an attempt to find a language that would accomplish the goal of the language of human rights, but within the context of our own, within our own context. And the document was identified as dignity, inclusion, and fair treatment. So
What happened to that?
it was embraced enthusiastically at General Synod and then taken home and put in a lot of filing cabinets. It was quite a so you can search it out and.
No, I was going to say, you can search it out and share it with us.
What year was that?
I'll, you know what, I will follow, I mean, I guess
Yeah.
I should be, in the interest of transparency and humility, I was part of the team that produced it.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to.
I'd love to see that.
Okay. What general synod was that?
You know, I'll search that out
Okay.
too, it was either late 1990s or early into the 2000s.
General Synod 2001, it is report 003D.
Report what?
003D.
D for donut.
Yeah, 003D.
It was still around in the conversation 3 years later at General Synod and in Council of General Synod after that, but, for the couple of years that I was there, but I don't know what happened to it after that. There was some, it was just there in the conversation, but it wasn't really doing much.
What year, Andrew?
2001.
I'll find it.
And we can share around so that we can see it. And that would probably be